At the turn of the century, the motor car's development mainly concerned speed. Scarcely had man developed petrol-driven cars than he began to race them. In those heroic old days, it wasn't a sport that was money-orientated. Early racing drivers were gentlemen fascinated by technical progress and amateur sportsmen who liked to take risks, like the famously bearded aristocrat René de Knif or the Count of Chasseloup-Laubat. Or else they were pioneers of the motor industry, eager to show off the capabilities of their products, such as the Renault brothers, Fritz von Opel, Émile Levasseur, the Dion and Bouton, the Michelin brothers, and later Vincenzo Lancia. It was the Elite Automobile Club de France which eventually turned the sport into an international confrontation. Teams came from manufacturers, the cars driven by their employees, who worked as mechanics, engineers or test drivers during the week and became racing drivers on Sundays. Thus began Enzo Ferrari's career at Alfa Romeo. The racing motorist earned prize money and wages, but racing at this time was simply a way of improving an employee's status while satisfying his will to race. The Grand Prix driver of the first 2 decades was more like a sort of motorized Ben-Hur, who risked his life in this dangerous sport for the greater glory of his country and employer, rather than to make his fortune. These early racing motorists also went in search of records. In 1929, Henry Seagrave reached 230 mph driving Golden Arrow for the honour of his country. Gradually, however, motor racing was moving from the open road to closed circuits. Thus it became a spectacle in its own right, and the driving aces vied with jockeys and boxers as heroic sportsmen of a golden age. Professionals entered the scene and the manufacturers fought for their services, although not with very high wages. The stars of the 30s, however, were still risking their lives by racing, and their reward was more often an accident than wealth. Few of them, however, made their living by racing, and Grand Prix fields were completed largely by wealthy amateurs. We had already reached the era of gentlemen drivers and professionals. It was the same in record breaking. The gentlemen drivers, Sir Malcolm Campbell and then John Cobb, both broke the 500 kph barrier in 1938. In Grand Prix racing, it was the organisers who ran the show. Entrants were invited to race, but a turning point came in 1950 with the creation of a Formula One World Championship, where competitors were invited to participate in a series of events. This process didn't guarantee a fee, and it didn't overcome haggling over money. In fact, the organisers allotted each competitor start money, which varied depending on the driver's fame, plus a contribution to travelling expenses, each entrant receiving his own fee, or as good a fee as he could bargain for. Of course, it was the big teams, such as Alfa Romeo and Mercedes, who profited most from this arrangement, even though they weren't racing for the money. The little teams, mainly British in the early 50s, who made up the bulk of the field, had to make do with what was left. This was particularly meagre, as the unprofessional organisers played upon the budgetary difficulties which made them look mean. Thus was born the practice of running start money specials. A team would run 2 cars. The most competitive would be for the #1 driver, while the second car was only intended to do a few laps in order to earn its start money. That, however, plus contracts signed with fuel companies and automobile equipment manufacturers, constituted the only earnings for a team right up to the end of the 60s. With the exception of 1 or 2 of the more affluent of teams, most had trouble balancing their budgets. At the beginning of the 70s, an English entrepreneur, Bernie Ecclestone, came on the scene. Having bought the Brabham team, he then suggested to his fellow team owners that they should get together to present a unified front to the organisers. Thus was born the Formula One Constructors Association, or FOCA, which would make its members their fortune by putting the Grand Prix house in order.
You just need to be competing for 1 year and shown to be doing a sensible job and apply for membership. And there's no particular advantage in being a member of FOCA. All the teams get the same benefits financially. It's the club that's been going a long time, and you know, we try to steer, and hopefully between us when we meet, we do something which we think is not good for each individual, and we don't make politics for each individual team. We try to do something that's good for Formula One racing.
Out of the limelight, the 70s were notable for the irresistible rise in power of FOCA, who, having knocked the organisers into shape, would now replace them as being the most influential body in Grand Prix racing. As the governing body was badly structured and without any apparent authority, FOCA, efficient and active, began to take a bigger and bigger slice of the Grand Prix cake, gradually taking control of Formula One. However, the election of a president determined to exercise his power as head of the governing body, FISA, changed everything.
Le sport automobile international se trouvait sous la tutelle d'une commission de la Fédération internationale automobile. J'ai été nommé en 1976 vice-président de la commission sportive internationale. Et j'ai découvert très vite, en quelques mois, qu'elle était sous le contrôle de lobbies de constructeurs, sous certaines influences germaniques notamment à l'époque, qui faussaient les règlements, qui mettaient en place des règlements dans l'intérêt de certains constructeurs de certains pays. J'ai marqué ma désapprobation en démissionnant bruyamment de ma vice-présidence internationale. Et c'est ainsi qu'à Melbourne, à l'Assemblée générale de la FIA, nous avons créé la FISA, la Fédération internationale du sport automobile, qui a bénéficié d'un statut d'autonomie à l'intérieur de la FIA.
Balestre wanted to assert his authority and put down FOCA. From that moment on, conflict was inevitable.
Tout le contrôle du championnat de Formule 1 était entre les mains de M. Gleason et de la FOCA. Pourquoi? À cause du vide de l'autorité sportive internationale, à cause de l'absence de pouvoir sportif international. Et le conflit, la grande guerre qui est intervenue dans les années 81-82 entre la FISA et la FOCA, c'est parce que nous avons exigé la reprise en main par nous-mêmes du pouvoir et de l'autorité.
We wanted a governing body that would govern the sport, because we were becoming, if you like, commercial. We were writing the rules, we were our own judge and jury and everything else, and it was extremely difficult. So, and then the president was a little ambitious, and he thought perhaps he should look after the commercial side as well as the sport, in which we didn't think was right.
Tension mounted, and the first confrontation erupted in 1980. Renault, Ferrari and Alfa Romeo had begun to use turbocharged engines, but the FOCA teams, mainly British, were still using the much cheaper, normally aspirated Ford Cosworth engines. But the latter were less competitive than the turbos. The FOCA teams wanted to ban the turbos, whose supporters had FISA on their side. In order to compensate for the relative lack of power, the Cosworth users used their chassis expertise to discover ground effect, which they were the first to master. But the drivers were alarmed by the physical effects of this phenomena, which so increased grip and therefore cornering speeds, and put pressure on FISA, who banned the sliding skirts, which were so vital to ground effect. FOCA had been defeated.
Big constructors were Renault and Ferrari could see that if they sided in with the federation, they may get the rules written to suit them. If you remember, it was the time of the turbo coming in and things like that. And they were looking for an edge in the rules to suit them. So that if we side in with the federation, we're going to get the rules written against those terrible English people.
Defying FISA, FOCA announced their intention to create a breakaway championship, and to prove that this was no idle threat, they organised their first race in South Africa at the start of the 1981 season, and all their teams duly attended. Balestre was furious. He wanted revenge. Formula One, however, was threatened by a split which could only be harmful. So Renault, Ferrari and Alfa Romeo deserted FISA's president and negotiated a compromise. After all, they needed respected competitors if their participation was to be credible. Balestre was beaten. Goodbye to his dream of total control.
Ça a duré 5 minutes d'ailleurs. Nous avons établi un gentleman's agreement, qui respecte les positions de chaque partie, c'est-à-dire la partie commerciale était pour lui et pour les constructeurs, les pilotes, etc., et les organisateurs, bien sûr, et l'aspect sportif avec des redevances normales, sous le contrôle de la Fédération internationale. Et c'est un document qui s'appelle l'accord Concorde, que nous avons mis au point avec 8 juristes de 3 nationalités dans nos bureaux. Les négociations ont duré 29 jours. 29 jours non-stop. Ce document, d'ailleurs, a résisté à l'épreuve du temps, puisque maintenant, il existe depuis 11 ans, et ça a toujours été la Bible, l'évangile du championnat du monde de Formule 1.
Faces were saved, but the two protagonists had their memories and ambitions of leadership. Even so, the affair brought together Eccleston and Balestre, who learnt to his cost that the so-called legalists or manufacturers weren't quite as loyal as he had hoped. So while the FOCA teams allegedly interpreted rules, such as the minimum weight, somewhat loosely, FISA, strangely lax, turned a blind eye. Exasperated, the legalists reacted by lodging protests after the 1982 Brazilian Grand Prix. Winner Piquet and second-placed Rosberg were disqualified, which stirred the whole thing up again. Nearly all the British teams objected to this decision and boycotted the subsequent San Marino Grand Prix. Renault and Ferrari were reduced to arranging a sham of a race in order to save face in front of the public. Each side seemed intent on killing the goose that laid the golden egg, and Formula One was going with it. It was the eminent Commendatore Ferrari, Formula One's own conscience, who would save the day. Thanks to his intervention and adjudication, the reconciliation was officially signed and sealed on his home ground at Maranello. This time, all interested parties were in agreement to make the 80s Formula One's golden age, although this would surely not be free. What was at stake was just as vital as the former adversary's previous argument. Since 1968 and the appearance of sponsors on racing cars, Grand Prix had become big business. Cigarette manufacturers and alcoholic drinks producers in particular were banned from advertising in other sports, but found themselves being offered an open international market in motorsport in general and Formula One in particular. FISA, FOCA, legalists and the rest all decided to pull together as one and reap the benefits. Only Ferrari refused to turn his thoroughbreds into cigarette packets, but he did allow one company to advertise discreetly on his cars in exchange for paying his drivers' salaries worth millions of dollars. At the same time, associated automobile manufacturers that had been traditionally involved with the teams wanted to become more and more involved, so the extent of that competition increased considerably. In the tyre sector, for instance, Dunlop had enjoyed a monopoly at the end of the 60s, but then American companies decided that they wanted to become involved in 1964 in order to promote their products in Europe. What was virtually an auction followed, with financial support going to the bigger teams and resulting in the withdrawal of Dunlop from Formula One. Michelin took up the challenge on behalf of Europe against Goodyear, the American giant, but then quit in 1984. Pirelli came in, but spasmodically and consequently with little success. When they quit, Goodyear was the sole supplier at the start of the 90s. Competition in the tyre supply resulted in considerable technological development, which in turn helped to make Formula One cars even faster. At the same time, however, it also meant that teams' tyre costs went up, and this was even further aggravated in the 80s by the use of soft compound tyres, which would be used in qualifying and last just for one lap. This apparently pointless course of action was at first limited and then abandoned altogether, thanks to Goodyear's monopoly.
We bring 2,300 to 2,400 tires to each racetrack. Depending on the rain, how well the qualifiers work, we'll use maybe 1,000 or 1,200 of them. We actually make about 30,000 racing tires for Formula One, for the races and for the testing. A lot of testing, as you well know, going on. We don't like to talk money, but it talks many, many millions of dollars, just Formula One.
This increase in the cost of competition had two different consequences. One was positive in that the larger teams weren't only supplied with free tyres, but were subsidised as well. But on the other hand, the downside was that the rest of the field had to spend an ever larger proportion of their already meagre budget on buying tyres. The increase in interest in competing came from two different fronts. There were the media benefits, for media interest in Grand Prix racing had grown considerably since the end of the 70s. And trade sponsors were also interested in using Formula One as a proving ground, which speeded up research and product development.
We get a lot of benefits from Formula One. One of them, of course, is to promote Goodyear and promote our racing image, our performance image. But certainly we do a lot of training, a lot of engineering development, different fabrics, different materials and tires, and it's a lot of good reasons for being here.
Technology developed in racing without doubt contributed to the development of production tyres. The lowering of profiles, widening of tread patterns, development of a radial carcass, rain patterns, etc. For a long time, the fuel company's role in Formula One was limited to that of part sponsors rather than technological partners, as only pump fuel could be used. But all that changed with the introduction of turbocharged engines at the end of the 70s. The specific problems of combustion which came with the use of these engines led to pressure being brought to bear on the fuel companies to supply sophisticated mixes of fuel which were specifically brewed for these engines. The banning of turbos at the end of the 80s changed little. Research continued, if not increased, in order to get the best out of the normally aspirated engines of the 90s.
Depuis le retour de Renault Sport, avec le moteur atmosphérique de F1, nous avons développé plus de 300 formulations de carburants spéciaux au sein du centre de recherche de Solèze. Une cinquantaine ont été sélectionnées pour être directement expérimentées sur le moteur de F1. Depuis le début de la saison 91, c'est 2 à 4 carburants spécifiques que nous emmenons à chaque Grand Prix, et c'est plus d'une vingtaine qui ont été expérimentés et utilisés sur le moteur de F1, aussi bien au banc que sur la piste.
The extraordinarily high-revving engines powering the Formula One cars of the 90s demanded ultra-sophisticated fuel, because the development of one went hand in hand with the other. But unlike the tyre situation, which became a monopoly, fuel companies vied with one another for supremacy in an increasingly competitive field where the products contributed considerably to an engine's power. The downside was that it was yet another money-gobbling situation, one more to add to the inflationary spiral to which Formula One was so vulnerable in the 80s and 90s. There was obviously a need to put a brake on this super-sophisticated research, which unfortunately was fatally threatening to the sport, simply because it was so costly. But the fuel companies didn't want to relinquish their hard-fought position as important technical partners.
Chi vuole interpretare la Formula 1 come un laboratorio sperimentale dove è libero fare la ricerca scientifica la più avanzata.
It has to be said that the reason why major companies wanted to invest greater and greater sums in Formula One was because that since the 70s, it had become one of the major media sports in the world, guaranteeing sponsors tremendous coverage. Bernie Ecclestone was the first to recognise the benefits, ensuring that Grand Prix would become media shows which would in turn reward the performers. In the 10 years between 1981 and 1991, the television viewing figures for the World Championship multiplied by 5, approaching 300 million according to FOCA, who sold the rights to nearly 100 countries. And that explains why the earnings of teams and drivers could be multiplied by 10.
Money which is put into Formula One is not put in for nothing. I mean, sponsors only are here to pay the money if they at least get the double back. I mean, nobody is stupid, especially in today's times. I think really Bernie did a fantastic job of keeping it all the time interesting, inventing new races in new countries to keep a consistently growth in Formula One. And the growth in Formula One means more media, more public, more spectators. That means more money put in and more sport and more interesting things come out. And it's amazing how Formula One develops.
The only bad thing about Formula One, in my opinion, is that it is so good that it destroys the rest of motorsport.
How much is a Grand Prix worth? And how are the earnings shared out? Each promoter pays out a fee to FOCA to hold a Grand Prix, understood to be between $1 million and $1.5 million. This money is shared out to the teams on a strict sliding scale, based on qualifying times, positions during and at the end of the race, and status in the Constructors' Championship. Let's take, for example, the case of the Cannon-Williams team in the 1992 Brazilian Grand Prix, where the team's drivers were first and second on the grid and finished in the same positions in the race, and the team led the Constructors' Championship. That performance earned them around $250,000 to $300,000. Add to that a share of the TV rights, most of which is bestowed by FISA to FOCA, and sponsors' fees. Under these conditions, it's no surprise that inflation has broken out like a rash in Formula One, and no one is entirely happy with it. And with the general adoption of carbon fibre, prices of monocoques have multiplied by 10. Each one costs £80,000, a total of around £500,000 for the season, added to which is £15,000 for a nose or a wing, £2,500 for a set of brake discs and pads, £5,000 for a clutch. But the advent of the electronic era has also caused prices to rise, with the appearance of telemetry and the development of ultra-sophisticated engineering systems such as active suspension, semi-automatic gearboxes, fly-by-wire acceleration and traction control. Only the top 3 or 4 teams can possibly keep up, thanks to budgets of 20 to 30 million, yet they don't pay for their works engines nor their drivers, paid for by sponsors. But the rest are hard pushed enough to get together the budget needed even to be amongst the 26 most competitive cars in the field, for it's so easy to slip into the role of an also-ran. They may only feed on crumbs. Fortunately, the meal itself is so rich. But that's how the paying driver system has come about. During the off-season, drivers, complete with attendant sponsors, search frantically for the best drive that they can buy with that sponsor's help. Some drivers bring the budget with them, although not always in direct proportion to their talent behind the wheel. It's a chase as frenetic as that on the track during the rest of the year. The sport and its stars are rich. But, as with anything where large sums of money are involved, however, there is greed, battles for control, conflicts of interest, and political manoeuvring. The actual sport begins to take second place. However, the flow of money that followed the huge sums spent by the tobacco companies began to dry up in the recession of the early 90s. Several teams went by the wayside. The top teams, however, had been introducing high-tech aids that began to take the emphasis away from the driver. There became a division between the haves with large budgets and the have-nots with substantially smaller ones. FISA and FOCA saw the need to cut costs, to bring the sport back within the monetary reach of the smaller teams, but the team owners couldn't agree on how. However, cutting back technology wasn't necessarily the answer, for this was the attraction of the sport for many, particularly the major automobile manufacturers and trade associates. In the early 90s, this was the dilemma facing the sport.
Le sport automobile, vous savez, il fait partie de la civilisation actuelle, c'est une civilisation automobile. Alors, le sport automobile trouvera toujours une solution de remplacement. Il existe depuis 90 ans, le sport automobile. Je crois qu'il va continuer encore un certain temps.